We'll get started. Thank you all so much for turning up. This is the first sort of webinar that Kent Connects has done. So if you find it beneficial, please provide some feedback. We'll give some contact details at the end, so that should all become clear. But hopefully we can give you some really useful advice and guidance on the new accessibility regulations today. So just to sort of introduce ourselves, my name's James Church. I'm Kent County Council's Digital Accessibility Compliance Officer, and I'm responsible for making sure that our authority is as compliant as can be. We also have Ben Watson from the University of Kent today.
Hi everyone. I'm the Accessible Information Advisor at the University, so I guess I do a very similar job to James up here at the University, and we've made a decision to work very closely together as two large public sector bodies in Kent to share our expertise and mainly to get reassurance that we're all on the same page. So a lot of the strategies that the university's employing are the same, have been co-designed with Kent County Council. So we feel quite confident that we're at least on the same page, and I think that's giving us an awful lot of reassurance that we're doing the right things, and we're covering more ground as a result.
Fantastic. So we've got a few slides just to give a bit of introduction and information about what we've been doing as Kent Connects over the last couple of years, and then we'll go into a Q&A session and let you guys in the audience ask the questions and ask us what you want to know about accessibility. If we can't answer those questions, we'll take them away and we'll try and ask those who might know the answers, and we'll get back to you on it. And if you do find this useful, as I said, please let us know, and there's a potential for future webinars on maybe more specific subjects, or maybe even physical training sessions for Kent Connects partners. So it's whatever the appetite is for. So just a bit of housekeeping quickly. Please ask questions via the YouTube chat. I know a lot of you have already started to do that, so that's great. Ben and I will try and keep up with it, but feel free to ask again if we do miss anything. Live captioning is available, so as you can see on the screen, it is there as open captions. When this webinar is over, it will be converted into a YouTube channel video, and it will be stored on this Kent Connects YouTube channel. So captioning will be available via YouTube's built-in captioning. And as mentioned, we will plan to do any future training courses or webinars on digital accessibility, depending on whether Kent Connects partners feel that they want it, more or less. So just a quick one on what accessibility is for those who may not know. It is the process of ensuring digital resources are usable and available to the widest possible audience, regardless of disabilities, regardless of ability. So this has been part of law for many years now already, since 1995 actually, but the main one was the Equality Act, which came into force in 2010, which meant that failure to make those reasonable adjustments in the workplace can result in a fine of up to unlimited damages and significant reputational damage. Now, this has been really beneficial for encouraging diversity in the workplace, but there was always issues when it comes to digital systems, digital accessibility, because it was hard to define what a reasonable adjustment was in terms of a digital interface. And so in 2018, the EU Web Accessibility Directive was turned into the public sector body's website and mobile applications #2 accessibility regulations, which now defines a reasonable adjustment under the Equality Act for web-based systems as compliance to the industry standard set of guidelines, which is WCAG 2.1 AA, and also every website must have an accessibility statement published detailing any non-compliance and giving the information to the users of the website to show them how to get help for their accessibility troubles if they need it.
I think I've found a useful way of explaining this to people who are coming to it quite new is, the Disability Discrimination Act and the Equality Act were very good at kind of raising people's awareness of general accessibility requirements and other, inclusive matters around the protected characteristics. But quite often people are very familiar with the idea of making access available to physical spaces, but as James says, less so around digital spaces. But if it's a useful way to think about the public sector bodies' accessibility regulations, it's a bit like putting ramps and lifts into information experiences. So it's exactly the same in principle, but I think there's always been an assumption that because something's available electronically, it's always accessible, but it's only accessible if you design it in a particular way in conformance with those web content accessibility guidelines that James just mentioned.
So I think the main reason we're here today is in the spirit of partnership working. As many of you know, Kent Connect has been around for a while. It's been doing some great work in Kent. But with these accessibility regulations, they do affect us all. We're all public sector bodies. The requirements are the same for all of us. So why silo ourselves, do the work over and over again in our individual organisations when we can collaborate? Because many of us share systems, many of us have the same systems. And if we collaborate on how to produce those central resources to help each other out and help our staff out, we are helping everybody as well as ourselves.
Absolutely, and I think the key thing is about trying to change the culture so that anyone who's designing something anew or thinking about a new digital resource or experience can be designing it with accessibility in mind. So we're getting it right at the beginning rather than sort of having to be told later on once we've published something that it wasn't quite right for all of our users. And our experience has 100% been that if you make something accessible that works for people who have perhaps more challenging barriers to accessing information, you just make better stuff. The stuff you end up with will work better on mobile platforms, and all of our users will find it easier to work with.
So, as I said, Ben and I have been working together from a KCC and university perspective for a few years now, and we combined this into a Kent Connect project, which we ended up titling the Kent Digital Inclusion Alliance. So Kent Connect have put some funding into this for a few things, which I'll cover in a second. But I thought it'd be useful to go over the existing work we've done and the resources we've already pushed out there, which you can utilise from today. So first thing we did was actually worked with Government Digital Services, who are actually the monitoring body for the regulations, to build their accessibility statement template, which I'm hoping that many of you have looked at and are using. From that, we produced what we call the Kent statement, which both of our organisations are using. So we've got a standardised accessibility statement, which covers all the benefits that we've just mentioned in the previous slide. On top of that, we produced a digital accessibility toolkit that's hosted on a website called LexDis, and I will put the link in the chat in a second, so you can all go and have a look at that. That has a bunch of guidance and support documents on there, such as how to do auditing, audit plans and resources, document and PDF guides on how to make them accessible, procurement guidance, all sorts of things. So I would strongly recommend having a look at that. GDS have had a look at it and they like the look of it. And it has been used nationally through all sorts of organisations, higher education, local government, and even central government in some cases. So we're trying to constantly build upon that and make it better. So any suggestions, please let us know again. And as I'm hoping many of you were at, we hosted the first Digital Accessibility Conference in Kent last year. That was hugely successful, with almost 200 people from the public sector in Kent and sometimes even further turning up. We had some great speakers such as Microsoft and GDS themselves come down and talk to us about what they're doing in terms of their commitments towards accessibility. And it was a hugely successful event. So we are working on this as Kent Connect, and we're trying to push out all of the guidance and knowledge we're doing to work in partnership to help out every other Kent Connect partner and everyone else nationally, I'd say, Ben.
Absolutely, yeah. And we're about to go on to the next year's conference.
Right. Yeah, so
we've got some exciting things to tell you all about this year's conference. We're very excited about.
Yeah, so as I said, we're not stopping on what we've already done, even though that's quite a lot of work, and we are trying to improve on it. So we are going to be producing a updated version of the LexDis toolkit, which we're quite suitably calling 2.1 AA, and that's going to have some new refined guidance, some great stuff on the accessible student journey that Ben's working on for the University of Kent, and a lot more information on procurement and FOIs. Most of this sort of being updated for when GDS are giving us more information and that sort of thing. As you'll be aware, we're also launching a monthly webinar or training session, sort of plan of action, program of work, and that means that we'll be able to hopefully provide support for Kent Connect partners on any sort of area of accessibility, because between us, we've been working on pretty much every area. We've spoken to people nationally about how to best deal with it, and we can be. I think we're well placed to put people in touch with the right people.
Absolutely.
At least point you towards the right guidance and support.
And also to connect you with other Kent Connects partners so that we can all arrive at a particular solution together. Because I think some of this work, often it feels in organisation that it ends up with, a relatively small number of people get kind of all the responsibility, and that can be quite a lonely place sometimes. So being able to share it with people in a similar boat in other organisations, I think, brings a lot of reassurance.
Finally, we're actually doing another conference. So, as I said, last year's conference was really successful, and there was appetite from Kent Connects to have another conference. So, I think tickets are probably going to go out from next week, and we'll distribute a link via Kent Connect's partnership office, and we'll get that out. That's going to be a 2-day conference this time, June 11th and 12th. The first day is going to be high-level, sort of management level over lectures and things from big companies. We've got a few confirmed speakers such as Microsoft, we've got GDS who have confirmed today, and we've also got Millie Knight, who, Ben, do you want to talk a bit more about Millie?
Yeah, Millie is a University of Kent student, but she's also a very successful Paralympic skier, medal-winning skier, and she's going to talk about her international experiences of accessibility. We're also hoping to have some colleagues from the University of Lille talking about their experiences of implementing the European directive, which is what these regulations kind of originally started life as on the continent. So it'd be really interesting to hear from them about how they're choosing to implement it. But it's a really good opportunity for anyone who isn't yet fully up to speed or feeling a bit uncertain about the regulations, just to come and mix with people who are genuinely in the same boat, get some ideas, make a few networks, and share what you've already done, and obviously benefit from the fruits of other people's ideas and work as well.
Yeah, and on that note, the final thing we're planning for at least this phase of the Alliance is being able to crowdsource and engage with the community more, and that's both within Kent Connect and wider, because as mentioned, the more we work together and we can group together with when it comes to things like procuring new systems, talking to suppliers, making sure that we get the correct information from these suppliers, the better it's going to be for everyone, because we all need to point to the same information. We're all procuring the same sorts of systems. So if we can put that community crowdsource pressure on suppliers, then they're more likely to take action. So we started working with JISC and some others to produce a new accessibility statement template, which we're going to ask central government to endorse and ask suppliers to fill in to give us some standard accessibility information, which we can then use for procurement, we can then use for just our own peace of mind. And we'll be comparing apples for apples rather than having that disjointed information, which is always different from each supplier.
Yeah.
We don't know where we can stand. So some really great stuff on the horizons. Today is the first part of that with this webinar. And really, it's down to you guys. So the chat is open. If you want to know something about accessibility, if you want to offer something for accessibility for the rest of the partners, we encourage you to do so. We have put some bullet points on the screen for you, so you can have a look at what sort of things we probably are looking for in terms of questions. But anything accessibility-wise, whether that's physical accessibility, digital accessibility, we can try our best to answer. So any questions, please let us know. We are going to pause for 30 seconds because there's a bit of delay on the stream from when we're talking to when it actually comes through. So we're probably not going to see the questions for a little while. But feel free to start asking any questions you may have, and we'll try our best to answer them live on the stream for everybody. I think to kick it off, we'll cover some questions we often hear from different people, and I think the first thing to probably raise is disproportionate burden. We often get asked about disproportionate burden because it's a mechanism in the regulations whereby if an authority doesn't feel like it has the resources to make something compliant to the regulations, then they can claim disproportionate burden and potentially, I suppose, get out of making that compliant.
Yeah, this is. I mean, it requires quite a lot of work, so it's not a free pass, but it would be a genuine thing. I think, particularly for some smaller partners who don't have a huge resource in terms of a web team and really need to focus on prioritizing the key materials to make accessible, because what everyone wants from these regulations is that it makes better access for people. So there's no real benefit in spending a load of time on content that's not very well used at kind of great expense to the organisation, when your time and effort could be much better spent in making the really key materials fully compliant. So the disproportionate burden mechanism was very much designed for that, to help us focus on the really important things, but not just to allow us to kind of ignore other parts of our digital estate, but to kind of recognise that we have priorities and that we still need to have a roadmap for compliance for those harder to reach areas. But it just perhaps buys us a bit more time. But the disproportionate burden assessment that you would be required to do can't just be a chat in a corridor where you say, oh gosh, that sounds a bit tricky, we've got loads of old PDFs that are going to be difficult for us to make accessible, therefore we'll claim disproportionate burden. It has to be a much more kind of forensic analysis of why you've come to that opinion that it's kind of too great a cost and resource to do at that time. We've done one for some elements of captioning at the university, where we have many thousands of hours of lecture recording, and we think it would be to do 100% full captioning on absolutely everything we do would just be disproportionately expensive. So we've calculated those costs, and we've decided what we think is a very sensible way to target those resources in the best way. But that document is something like 20 pages long, where we justify that approach and talk about how we're going to embed new increasingly accurate AI systems in the future to help us improve our ability to do captioning.
Yeah, and okay, so Medway have asked a couple of questions. I'll answer Medway's second question first around PDFs, because it's regarding disproportionate burden. So we've seen a fair number of public sector organisations ask about claiming disproportionate burden for PDFs. And when we've spoken to GDS, even informally, one of the things they always say is that PDFs shouldn't really be a disproportionate burden because they're quite easy to manage despite there being big numbers. So one of the things that we're trying to do at Kent County Council, and the university doing the same thing actually, is I think every public sector organisation has thousands and thousands of PDFs on their websites, and under the regulations there is an exemption for office-based file formats such as PDFs if they're not used for active processes. So if they are archived content and not used for anything that is a key journey for a user to be able to get information or do something, so if it's there purely for reference, then it can stay there. But as soon as you do move it into sort of the live area and it's being used as part of a process, then it must be compliant. So if you can identify what documents are historic and what documents are still being used, then already that cuts down a massive number of those PDFs. Then it's a case of making sure there's the correct policy in place, making sure you're going back to your PDF owners and asking them to make it compliant. I'll link back again to the document that we produced on LexDis, our toolkit, which is how to make documents and PDFs compliant. And realistically, the best thing you can do with documents and PDFs is just make sure that in Word you're using the accessibility checker, which is built in, because it is an automated tool, yes, but it is quite good. And if you can eliminate all of the big warnings and errors in the accessibility checker before you convert to a PDF, then as long as you're converting to a PDF A compliant format, then you're eliminating the accessibility compliance issues with those PDFs. And it's a case of not making sure that you're 100% ready with every single PDF as soon as you can, but making sure that process is in place to start iterating over your PDFs.
And some of this is what your accessibility statement will help you with. You can talk, you can be quite honest and say, look, we do have quite a large legacy of PDF documents that we don't think will be fully accessible by the date September 2020, for example. But you can, as James has said, give a very clear roadmap for how you're putting it right for future documents to stop the problem getting any worse or any bigger. But also in your accessibility statement, you can say to users who may experience problems with some of those PDFs what they can do to get an immediate resolution and a quick turnaround, so that the problem will be dealt with on a kind of on-demand basis for that legacy stock.
And to move on to Medway's first question, actually, ARIA markup is essentially it's tags you can use in your HTML, in your markup languages when you're building your websites, and it's essentially some labels for assistive technologies such as Screen Reader to be able to provide the user with accessible information. So some of the CAG criteria, such as non-text content, mean that if you do have some non-text content like an image, then you're required to have a suitable alternative so that things like assistive technologies can pick them up. And there is different success criteria for different things. But for images, you're supposed to have an alt tag, which is, again, a markup tag which provides that alternative to a screen reader. And for some elements, you may choose to use ARIA tags as well, or instead of. And that will, anything you put in the ARIA tag will be read out by the screen reader when you're selecting that element. So it's hard to describe without seeing an element, but if you think about the key user journeys when you're going through your website, if there's an element where you think, okay, say a blind user would get stuck on this element, then what you can do is provide an ARIA tag for it, and that tag will then give information to the screen reader or to the assistive technology to help out that user. So I would definitely recommend using them wherever you can. Some like to use them for every element, some only like to use it for selected, but they are really useful for improving the accessibility of your website. And when you run your site through particularly automated tools, the tools do see those favourably. So great tool to use, I would recommend it. Moving on to Simon's question. So the EU directive the public sector body regulations has an exemption for web-based maps, in that maps are quite inaccessible by nature because they're very visual, and you can probably imagine that trying to describe a map to a blind person is a very difficult thing. If you're using a map for anything other than, say, navigation, so if you're using it to display some information about a point or an address or location, for example, then the map itself is exempt so long as there is a suitable alternative which is in accessible format and easy to get to alongside the map. So going back to the idea about a point on a map which is showing an address, if that address is in a text format next to the map, for example, then that then becomes compliant and you don't have to worry about the map on your site. I hope that clears that up, Simon. Question from Michelle: do our suppliers have to be fully compliant?
This one's how long's a bit of string? This one's a tricky one. Essentially, the safest answer is to say yes. There again in LexDis we've got something called the third-party supplier matrix, which is a decision tree that will kind of ask you a bunch of questions about the nature of your relationship with a particular supplier. One of the key criteria is, do you pay for the resource that you get from that supplier, that's one of the key things. If you pay for it, the likelihood is that you very much are responsible for it. But I kind of take a kind of broader view of all of this. That actually, if it's something that we're offering and it's key to the delivery of our service, whether we're ultimately, responsible for it under these regulations or not, isn't it something that we would want our users to get the very best experience from and not have annoying frustrations because we've selected a tool that doesn't actually work for everyone? So I would say have a look on Lexdis and look at this matrix, which James and I can make sure the link comes around directly to it. But James is going to put it in the chat.
While you're talking.
But it's there are other criteria that if you're using something, WordPress or some other third-party site, and you've kind of adapted it, if it's got your branding on it, you're almost certainly responsible for it. But as we were saying, this is the opportunity where even if you've not asked it at the original kind of signing up of the contract, at the point of contract renewal, or indeed just now that you've found out about these regulations, I think there's always an ongoing opportunity to demand that suppliers do better. If we're paying for something, then we're actually paying double in a way, because if we're let's say it's some sort of booking system or something that we're using on one of our systems, if it's not accessible, then we locally have to have extra workarounds. Maybe we therefore have more people using the telephone lines to contact us because they're unable to use the online bookings. In a way, there's an extra cost there. So I think there's a good justification to go back to suppliers and say, well, what's your roadmap for being compliant? And the very simple question to ask them is, are they compliant with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 AA? If they're not, where are they not compliant? And what is their plan for improving on that position? If your contract's then coming up for renewal anytime reasonably soon, you've got an excellent set of bargaining chips to go back to them and say, well, you're not compliant, but your competitors are. That obviously would put some pressure on them and give them a business incentive. Or it's going to cost us a lot of money to rectify this locally and identify workarounds. Therefore, we want a 50% reduction.
Yeah, well, and that's just it, Ben. I mean, if it's worth mentioning to the supplier. Well, actually, no, the suppliers who public sector normally deal with are very aware of these regulations in general, and they know that we all have to meet them as public sector bodies. So if a supplier cannot provide an accessible product, then at the end of the day, they are going to lose out on business when it comes to the public sector. So it's worth highlighting to them that they have the incentive of making sure that they keep their current customers in us as public sector bodies by making sure they are being accessible. So, suppliers do need to do it if they want to keep selling to us. We need to make sure our suppliers are providing accessible products where possible. And that's a very good follow-up question, Michelle. Michelle's asked, what if there is no alternative? And that is a tough one because it depends on your organisation's risk appetite. Ultimately, every organisation is going to have somebody responsible for these regulations at the highest level. So usually it's going to be a head of legal sort of person. And it's honestly up to them to chat and to make the decision on whether they want to accept the risk of being non-compliant for a service if it delivers other benefits in terms of the statutory process or in terms of it provides benefit to the community that outweighs some of the accessibility issues. That will come up in your procurement processes, and it's down to your risk appetite. Because as well as non-compliance under these regulations and the issues that may come from the monitoring body finding issues and passing them to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, there is a bigger risk almost from your members of the public and your staff who may want to raise a challenge using these regulations under the Equality Act, and that means that you are open to secondary challenge then. So it's about making sure that the person who ultimately makes the decision is fully aware of the risks, and then if they want to procure an inaccessible product, then that is their call. But again, the regulations state that you must not procure any inaccessible products. So there is an argument for whether you're knowingly breaking the law there. But that's for each organisation to make in terms of risk.
I think quite often I feel like we really spook people when we talk about these new regulations, but I think it's important to realise that there's actually nothing new in terms of our ultimate obligations than we had under the Equality Act. It's just as James said before. I guess what these regulations give us is a more clarity around what a reasonable adjustment is, i.e., does it meet these 50 WCAG criteria or not? So it arguably makes it clearer, but ultimately we had to do all of this anyway. So try not to be too spooked. And what we're getting back from the government digital service, who would be doing the monitoring, is that what they really want to see is public sector bodies giving this a go. Clearly having a plan. A clear direction of travel, identifying priorities, and there's all sorts of ways you could do that, such as, looking at your typical user journey, looking at the number of hits you get on your website, so that you're dealing with the highest priority things first. Maybe looking at parts of your web estate that are particularly focused on people who may face some extra kind of accessibility challenges. They would be obvious parts of your web estate to make sure you get fully compliant, in that order of priority.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So we have a question now from Folkestone and Hive District Council. They've asked if they fund or partially sponsor a charity or similar, are they liable for the uncompliant charity site as well? That is an interesting one. It's a grey area. I would definitely recommend consulting your legal teams at first. But GDS have actually refined their accessibility guidance over the last few days to mention some partially exempt services, sites, that sort of thing. Essentially, if charity specifically they've mentioned, and if the charity is mostly, so I'd assume that means more than 50%, but again, consult your legal teams. If it's mostly funded by the public sector body or by the public money, then it comes under the regulations. So it's a tough one. Now, if your name and your branding is on the charity website, if there's a clear link, then you've got to think about the reputational damage risk of a charity or other being non-compliant, and make sure that the people that need to know are aware that there is that secondary reputational damage risk there. And I think that's as much as we can say on that. It depends on the charity and what the circumstances are around the relationship and how it's being funded. But GDS have confirmed that non-government organisations are mostly exempt. Charities, if they're publicly funded, if there's services that provide to the public, things like schools, parishes, housing associations, if they are publicly funded, they are technically in scope. So on that note, there is what GDS call partially exempt public sector bodies, which they say are things like schools. However, they caveat it as partially exempt, meaning that if there's key user journeys, they still need to be accessible. But if you think about it, by making the key user journeys accessible, you almost have to make the platform accessible, which means you're making the website accessible anyway. So the partial exemptions almost mean full compliance anyway.
Yeah.
And the key is if you're thinking purely from your organisation, if you fund something, then ultimately, depending on whether you fund it fully, partially or not, then the responsibility will come back to you in some way, even if it's just reputational.
And I think if you're working with a kind of partner organisation, you're better off bringing them on this journey with us. Otherwise, there will be a very clear break in your user journey when they link from your site out to the related partner site. That there's going to be a break in the chain. So I think there's, as Kent, and this is what the theme of our conference last year was, that why don't we try and make Kent as a county, digitally accessible, and by sharing that knowledge and expertise. And do you know what? As we said before, you make something accessible, it will genuinely be better, a better experience, better user experience. Accessibility and usability are very much two sides of the same coin. But you'll find that more people can access your stuff, so it's actually kind of improving the kind of numbers that you get on your website. The more people perhaps who engage in the community efforts you're making. So I think there's a broader reason for doing this other than the legal objectives that we've got, which are all very very clear now, the ethical objectives, which have always been very clear. But actually, even if they weren't enough to motivate some people, then it's still worth doing for the business benefits that it will bring.
Yeah, and from our discussions with GDS, they want to see that organisations are taking active steps towards compliance at this stage. It's not you must be 100% compliant on the deadline, otherwise that you're going to incur penalties. It's if you can show GDS that you are making those steps towards compliance and you're not just ignoring the regulations, you're not ignoring the needs of your users. And the key thing for that is the accessibility statement being in place, because that gives the users the information. Then you are pretty much certainly showing that you're taking steps towards compliance, and that means that you'll be seen more favourably than an organisation that aren't. So I think that the priority for all of your organisation's websites is make sure you get a statement up there and make sure you at least do some basic checks, even if they are with an automated tool or just keyboard journey, that sort of thing. So you can give some basic information to GDS and to your users.
On LexDis, we'll put a link into it in a second as well. In addition to the automated tools that James has mentioned, there's a quick accessibility check guide that colleagues have put together, which is a really useful way to kind of identify the basic kind of user journey and to do that basic level of testing to get some reassurance that your core content is up to scratch. So we'll pop that link in a moment.
Yeah, of course. So Selena's asked, how severely will organisations be penalised? Is making an accessible PDF as bad as forgetting ARIA tags throughout the site? So it's tough to say because we aren't the monitoring body. Ultimately, the maximum penalties are what the Equality Act says, in that it's up to unlimited damages. You've got the secondary problem of reputational damage, as I've mentioned, and you can get challenged multiple times up for the same thing. Now, in terms of if one thing is as bad as another, that's more of a risk-based question. Do you think there's more risk in prioritising accessibility issue X over accessibility issue Y? And as I said, if a website is deemed non-compliant in one area, then it technically is not compliant with the regulations at all. So there needs to be a level of prioritisation for websites, and I would personally look at the key user journeys first. So if you don't use ARIA tags, then at least make sure that you are doing something else, like making sure all of your images have alt tags, making sure there's an alternative. ARIA tags aren't the end of the world because there are different ways of meeting the success criteria, despite them being very useful. If a PDF isn't accessible, if it's part of a user journey that most people are using, so for example, if you're giving really important advice in a PDF format on the front page of a website to the public, then you definitely should prioritise that over an ARIA tag that might be missing on a page which is only viewed 5 times a week. There's a level of prioritisation going on there. So,
but from what we've been reasonably fortunate to be kind of plugged in to the Government Digital Service and a lot of their thinking around the development of how they're going to monitor these things. And it really does seem that they're much more in a collaborative mood than in a punitive one. So I think as long as you were showing, as James said, a clear roadmap, clear good intentions to prioritise your content and take steps to try and change the culture, do some training. They will give you every opportunity to put right anything that isn't absolutely perfect that they may find should they monitor you. One of the words that I've certainly heard used in the past is as kind of a belligerence. I think the only way you would really upset them was an active belligerence to deny these regulations exist and basically do nothing. That would clearly not be a very good step, but then that wouldn't be a very good step as a public sector organisation that wants to kind of provide good community spirited services, because that's surely none of us would ever want to be in that kind of boat. We're in public service to help everyone. So I think as long as you're following these basic steps that we've identified and you've got a clear plan, you'll be fine.
Yeah, at least based on what GDS have told us so far and what they've outlined as their plans. A few months ago, they did release a memorandum of understanding where they detail how they're going to do their monitoring, and there's a couple of things they're going to be doing. They're going to be doing basic checks, or a basic check is what they call it, on the vast majority of the websites that they look at as part of their monitoring process this year, and that's going to involve using an automated tool, which is either going to be Axe or SiteMorse. No, SiteImprove. I don't know.
No, SiteMorse.
Is SiteMorse?
Yeah.
So they're going to be. I think they're primarily going to be using Axe though. So that's the automated tool they're going to be using. So if you can run the automated tool on your site and fix the issues that come up on that, then compliance-wise, you're likely to be reducing the risk massively of GDS finding anything that's going to cause an issue. And I suppose also they're going to be doing a selection of manual audits using real people with disabilities, and assistive technologies on a small selection that is, of the websites they look at. And that's where they're going to look. We don't know if they're going to talk to you first or just provide you with a report after, but they're at least going to provide you with a report after detailing the results of the audit, and they're going to expect to have a plan presented to them and work with you with that plan to make sure that you are fixing issues in a timely manner and providing that support to users. Again, if they do find things, the best thing to do is list them on your known issues in your accessibility statement and get some concrete timescales as to when these will be fixed, and then that's all they're expecting to see in terms of how they work with you, and that covers it. But that should be part of your plan for dealing with your website anyway, as an organisation. So
a really good thing about this is if you can change the culture, because auditing your website, even if you were fortunate enough to have a website that fully passed on a particular day, depending on how your training has gone with all of the people who have access to make changes to that website, the very next day, if somebody didn't perhaps have all of the full training around how to be compliant, they could add 100 wonky PDFs and we're back to where we started. So I think this is seen as a kind of an ongoing journey, that we're all on. It's not just about a mad gallop to September 2020 and then we can all breathe a sigh of relief and go back to our old ways. This is about a sustainable approach to delivering accessible content for forever, going forward. So, and if that takes some people longer, but they're reaching, more broadly and more kind of effectively throughout their organisation, then that's an equally defensible position.
Yeah, I agree. Michelle has said, are you able to send the webinar as well as all of the links to the supply matrix? Yes, so what we will do is Kent Connects will send out links to everything after this webinar's finished. As I mentioned, this webinar will be available on this YouTube channel in future, so you can watch it back. And we will also send out a questionnaire to ask what you thought of it, and if there's a topic you want us to cover in a future webinar or a future training session, whether that's physical or not, then that's also on the table, because again, the partnership's hoping to support partners with accessibility in any way that it can. So we'll be providing all of that. Sammy has asked, what's the best way to encourage slightly resistant content creators to push out accessible content? That's a very, very good question, Sammy. And it's about making these content creators understand where their content is going, for one, who's using it, and how making it accessible benefits those end users. Because ultimately, a member of staff is creating a piece of content for somebody to read, and if that person can improve their accessibility, or the accessibility of their content, in the same way that you would make sure it has a clear title, make sure it just looks presentable, then you're actually helping the users who are looking at your content to understand it and read it and become more engaged with that content. So even if it's just creating a report for your manager, if you can make that report more accessible, then they might have an easier time, even if it's just with things like plain English, reading it, understanding it, engaging. So think about your end users and think about those use cases for where your content is actually going, particularly if it's published on a website.
Yeah, I think a particularly powerful way to kind of get that message across is through the empathy training, where you can maybe have some case studies, ideally videos, or some transcripts of conversations with end users where perhaps they talk about the frustrations of inaccessible content and how it's impacted their ability to use your service. I guess if they're completely resistant, then you could try tickling them with the kind of business incentives around it. That if you design really clear content that's easy to use, works across a range of platforms, and you've explained all your acronyms, and you use plain English, then perhaps related services and support structures may not be as heavily kind of in demand. Help phone lines and stuff like that. If people can get the answer on your website in a sensible way, then perhaps that would save money elsewhere. So I think there are multiple lines of inquiry, but ultimately it's the right thing to do, so do it. If that doesn't work, then hit them with the legislation.
Yeah. I think I just wanted to touch on a question that I've had offline about auditing, actually. We've been asked about whether using automated tools is sufficient for becoming compliant, because most organisations don't have the resources to internally host a manual accessibility auditing team, or go externally, because prices on G-Cloud can range from about £1,000 a day to £1,500 a day for an auditor, so it's not cheap. But automated tools, unfortunately, only pick up about 20 to 30% of all accessibility issues. And as I said earlier, GDS are going to be using some of them for their testing. And if you can produce the same results as they will using a tool like Axe, then they will be able to, you're more likely to be compliant in the eyes of their audit. In terms of your overall accessibility low, you really do need to try and get a manual process in place to do these checks. The thing I would often recommend for web teams is make sure you build accessibility checking into your software development processes. I think that's vastly important, because there's lots of things you can do at lots of different stages of the deployment which let you do your own checks. Even things like every time you develop a page, if you just make sure that it's got suitable alternatives for non-text content. When you develop a new navigation bar, run through it with a keyboard. Microsoft has a very good tool called Accessibility Insights, which actually lets you map the keyboard tab stops on your website, and you can follow that. And if something goes from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen, or the bottom of the website, and then going back up to the top, and it's not in a clear and meaningful sequence, then you already can see there's issues. So just building those processes into your software development lifecycle is the easiest way to make sure that in future you're staying compliant, because really every deployment you do could knock out compliance. So it's vital that you do checks, and it's also vital that you can, to a degree, substantiate what suppliers are telling you about their product as well, even if that's just using an automated tool. So that if the supplier does commit to saying that they're contractually compliant, then at least you can then either confirm that at a glance or say, why has my automated tool picked up these things then? Can you go and fix them?
Yeah.
And it reduces the risk then to your organisation as well.
An important thing to remember, and something that certainly in the procurement phase you can easily kind of forget about, these regulations apply equally to front-facing parts of a system, but also to the the staff-facing side. So they've got to work for everyone. So this isn't just about public-facing stuff. This is about the systems that we use internally and the ability to create those public-facing systems. That all of it is covered and all of it needs to work so that staff with accessibility needs, their requirements are equally reflected by these regulations.
Yeah, fantastic. We will answer any other questions in the chat, potentially offline. We've sort of reached the end of the hour we allocated to this now. But if you do have any questions, feel free to get in touch with Kent Connect. We'll post the Kent Connect email in the chat as well in a second, and we'll try and answer them offline. We will be sending out a questionnaire after this to ask if there's a follow-up webinar or a follow-up training session that you'd like. That can be as big or small as you want it to be, and we will sort of plan future content based on what Kent Connect partners are asking for. Also mentioning that we are hosting our next conference in June. Keep the date free. Again, with the questionnaire, we'll send out a link to the tickets page for that conference. It's a free conference for Kent Connect partners. It would be great if we could see all of your names and faces on the list, because it's going to be vitally useful, whether that's for the first day of those lectures or the second day of those sort of more in-depth workshops on specific topics such as the auditing side and the strategy side of things. We're going to try and get some really cool things like an M3 lab down there as well, but that's all in the works, so we'll keep you updated on that. Thank you very much for coming to the webinar, for listening to
your
us,
questions.
and
really
for questions.
interesting.
Great questions. I'm hoping we've at least helped answer some of those questions, and that we can move forward as a county with this. Building accessibility to your web-based systems is the right thing to do at the end of the day, and the more people that we can make aware of these regulations, even if it's just to pressure them to take it seriously, then the better. So please, please, please talk to people about this. Make sure your teams are aware, make sure your management's aware of accessibility and the need for it, and eventually we will tackle this as a county, and Kent Connect is going to be at the forefront of that.
Thank you, everyone.